Hi, I'm Charlie Spicer, and I'm an executive editor at St. Martin's Press, and we're here today with Bill Floyd. We are about to publish Bill's first novel, The Killer's Wife, a book we're very, very excited about. So without further ado, I'm going to fire some questions off at Bill and get some idea about what made him interested in the story and about writing it. Bill, what inspired you to write The Killer's Wife?
Well, I had been thinking for quite some time about issues of denial, guilt, and responsibility in general and in American society, and as well as in interpersonal relationships. And I remember the story of the Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, which was in the news a few years ago. And he was unusual for a serial killer in that he wasn't a loner or one of the guys that people refer to as, being the stereotypical stalker loner type. He was a man who had a family and children, was active in his community, and had been known for 20, 30 years by these intimate, close family members who apparently didn't have a clue as to what his real nature was. And I thought during the news coverage when he was on trial and such, oh my God, what must this man's family have thought? And how hard must it be for them to live with themselves knowing that A, they didn't pick up on the clues, or B, they saw clues that should have told them something was going on and instead were able to somehow deny it. And I thought that's such an insight into people's psyche that they can have that level of denial about people that they're supposed to know so intimately and so well, and yet they can be a completely different person from what they originally thought.
As an editor, I deal with a lot of writers, and each writer's process of writing is very different. Some authors tell me they start a novel and they have no idea where it's going to end up. Others outline it down to the smallest detail. What is your process for writing?
It tends to shift from novel to novel depending on the subject matter. For this one, it is, like I said, I had been thinking about a lot of these issues for a long time prior to hearing the story about Dennis Rader and reading about that in the news. Once I did, that set off this idea of having someone who's on the run from her past and had to deal with the idea that she actually was married to, slept with, was intimate with someone who turned out being a complete sociopathic monster. But for this novel, I outlined it very much in detail before I began the actual writing of it because I wanted to know, mostly about the main character and get her sound in my mind, as well as knowing what was going to happen in the long run. A lot of times you can start out with a good idea, start writing, and you'll find as a writer that it changes during the course of the novel, and that sometimes characters will do things you didn't necessarily want them to do. And you kind of let the story lead you. That's some of the best part of it, is when the story takes itself over. So I find it helps to have a really good, sound foundation to start from so that you don't have to rewrite as you go, but you know what the characters are going to be, you know what you want the themes to be, and then you can work on the prose and delivering it in a readable and hopefully eloquent manner.
One of the things all readers of this book have also commented on is that it's much more than a thriller. It's a novel about marriage, it's a novel about relationships, and it's a novel about secrets. In this case, a woman discovers the man she's married to is not at all the person she thought he was. Were you intending to say anything about marriage, about secrets, about how people hide unpleasant facts from themselves?
Yeah, it was less about marriage as an institution, which can be a wonderful and beautiful thing and one of the foundations probably, but it's much more about personal responsibility and how we ourselves often choose to blind ourselves to things that we should see. It's much more about an individual's relationship with themselves in terms of how they relate to the people in their lives. A lot of us just tend to find something we think works and then go with it without examining it closely enough to see where the faults may lie. And it's more about people dealing with their own culpability and their own responsibility in that rather than blaming the other person or an institution in general.
One of the characters who fascinated me, and we don't see him a lot in the book, is Randall himself. And early in the novel, he sort of seems like a more or less normal husband and father. Well, by the end, we know he is evil incarnate. The question is, do you think Randall was at any point curable, or whether there are people who are just simply born evil?
It seems from the evidence that's given with the reality of serial killers and stuff that there are simply some people who are sociopathic. They don't seem to be able to be cured of these things. They don't seem to be able to get rid of the impulses that drive them. There's also evidence to suggest that a lot of them were abused early on and that the abused often become abusers. that's a different sort of thing. I think there is hope for those such people. But there are other people who simply seem to be missing some human component, which is usually defined by psychiatrists as empathy, where they don't see other human beings as real, only as playthings basically for their gratification. Randy was one of those. He saw his wife as that, and he saw others as that. One of his cruelest and most vicious tricks was what he did in leading his wife into believe they had a normal marriage, and then in trying to implicate her in his crimes.
One of the things that interests me at the end of the novel, and it's left somewhat ambiguous, but I'm curious to ask you now that we're having a conversation, what do you think Nina's life will be like after this? Do you think she will remarry? Do you think she will go on to live any kind of normal life? She's been through an experience no one could imagine. What do you think the future holds for her?
Well, that's hard to say, and that's one of the things that I wanted to kind of leave up to the reader. The final scene of the novel leaves some hope for her to perhaps try to form other relationships. She's been scared since Randy to even basically form any kind of, intimate relationship with anyone except her son. I think going forward she'll try to focus on healing, focus on her son. And now she also has some other people in the community and her work life that know her. And also she can start off from a basis of truth, because now her past has been revealed. She no longer has to hide behind an assumed identity. She no longer has to dispute that her past occurred. And I think when people do that and they face that and they pay the cost of the things that have happened to them and their own mistakes, then that's the way they can move forward. So I have some hope for her.
Do you think there was anything in her personality that made her particularly vulnerable to someone like Randall?
I don't think that there was anything that particular except her being an American person at this particular time in our history. I think it's endemic that we're all indulging in this sort of denial and refuting our own culpability in our own lives, as well as in a larger political sense as well.
Two of the more distinct characters, kind of quirky in how they're drawn, but fascinating, are the characters of Dwayne and Carolyn Rao, the investigators. Were these modeled on people you knew, or how did you come up with them? Because they're unusual and they're different from other characters we've seen in similar stories.
Yeah, well, the private investigator is, of course, an archetype of its own in crime fiction. And in this case, I actually know a couple, a man and his wife, who are private investigators. The man was a former police officer who was wounded in the line of duty. After that, he formed his own private investigation agency with his wife. They described to me a lot of the things they do. They have some, of course, fascinating, hilarious, and sad stories to go along with it. The main thing that fascinated me about them was that he used to work for the police side, the prosecution side, and once he began working for the defense side of things, he began to see things from a whole different light, the whole criminal aspect. He began to see where people can be railroaded, where evidence can be manufactured and manipulated. And to see him change in that way I thought was fascinating, and that's reflected in the characters in the novel, who begin as hired guns for the Charles Pritchett character, but end up, once they realize what they've done, they try to take responsibility for their actions and to try and heal and to help Nina out.
Now, here's a question I know you've been asked before and that I know readers will continue to ask. What did your own wife say when she learned you were writing a novel about a woman who discovers she's married to a serial killer?
Well, she didn't get that at first, and after I told her, I figured I better explain that before the novel came out. But she gave it another read, and she thought it was insightful, and she enjoyed it, and I think she's fairly certain I'm not a serial killer, so she's on board.
Bill, this was great to be able to ask you all these questions, and thank you very much for coming in.
My privilege. I appreciate it.